Okay, we're back. Part three. I have my tea. It's not winter today, but still good. I think it's just black tea. Okay, so I'm watching this debate between Michael Huemer and Robert Sapolsky, along with commentary from Joe Schmid, or I'm not sure how to say his name. Someday maybe I will, and Taylor Sire. I chose to watch it this way because I'm such a novice when it comes to the debate on free will. I know it from like in the 90s when I had classes on this stuff. Really, before I even went to graduate school. No, during graduate school, but my first couple years of graduate school. So, from a long time ago, in other words, when I was a student, I don't work on free will. I don't write about it. I have an interest in it. I come from a background of having very strong libertarian intuitions. I've gradually, over time, by thinking about these issues, come to be more friendly towards compatibilism, which I used to not be friendly towards at all. Now I am a more friendly. I understand it more than I did. But still, there's a lot that I don't know. A lot has been developed since then. And so it's very good to have this expert commentary here. I've been learning a lot from it, from this very cool Majesty of Reason channel, which I think you should all subscribe to. Okay, so let's go ahead and pick up where we left off because we're still in Humer's opening remarks here. He hasn't got past his first slide.
So that's about people's judgments about these things, but also there are people's emotional reactions. So there are these reactive attitudes, as philosophers call them. If you feel pride, remorse, guilt, blame, praise, or gratitude for any action that anybody does, then it seems like you're presupposing that people are responsible for their actions. And that would not be true if
Yeah, this is your classic. I guess who started this line? I think it's Strawson, right? Galen Strawson, or over the reactive attitudes business. But the compatibilists are usually the ones who use this as a way to try to get their point across. That look, even if compatibilism is true, we're not going to give up these reactive attitudes. So it's a bit weird for him to be using this as an argument against. I mean, obviously, everyone thinks it's like something about free will is importantly involved here, but is the heart determinist really going to be moved by this stuff? I don't know. They're going to say, look, we just act irrationally a bunch of the times because we're determined to act that way. I don't really find this to be super convincing. But
of free will. I note that my claim here is not that it's impossible to have these attitudes if hard determinism is true, but that if hard determinism is true, these attitudes would be inapt, or they would involve you in making some kind of mistake. So, in other words, the person who's having these attitudes is assuming that determinism isn't true.
What do you make of his claim there?
Yeah, so I guess given that I am convinced by Frankfurt cases, unsurprisingly, I think actually no. Reactive attitudes like blame, resentment, indignation, those could be fitting even if a person lacked alternative possibilities. Assuming that they did what they did for their own reasons, they weren't, controlled by the neuroscientist pressing a button and overriding their decision-making power, all that, right? They don't need alternative possibilities. So this is again another point where Huemer might disagree. He might not be convinced by Frankfurt cases, but many people are, and it's worth kind of engaging with that kind of challenge to his line of reasoning. The other thing we might say here is there's a famous paper also from the 60s by P.F. Strawson called Freedom and Resentment, where Strawson.
Oh, was it P.F. Strawson, not Galen? Uh-oh. Yeah.
Argued that whether or not determinism is true is not the sort of thing that could undermine these reactive attitudes. In fact, we call them reactive attitudes because of Strawson. He gave them that sort of title. And I'm not personally very moved by the Strawsonian approach to thinking about moral responsibility, but it's a very interesting paper, and a lot of contemporary theorists are motivated by Strawsonian type reasoning. So yeah, suppose we were to find out that determinism is true, so all of us are determined. Suppose Sapolsky convinced us of that. Would we immediately stop praising and blaming each other or having these reactive attitudes? Or even if we couldn't avoid it, Huemer was sensitive to this distinction. Even if we couldn't stop, would we regard all of those reactive attitudes as inapt? It seems hard to think that that's how we should think about those reactive attitudes. And to the extent that you're moved by that kind of reasoning, you might think, yeah, determinism's irrelevant to moral responsibility.
Huemer's here kind of really trying to push that responsibility requires free will in the leeway sense specifically. Yeah. And I did want to see what you think about some cases.
Lots of people feel that intuition very strongly, including myself, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and the other ones as well. So I don't think he's wrong to be pushing this. I think it's a very strong intuition. The question is, how much weight we should give intuitions.
Trying to motivate that, because that might be what Huemer pushes us towards. So I know Justin Capes has this impenetrable force field case. So I think there's like a drown. You're walking by a shallow pond, and there is a child which is drowning in the pond. This is a familiar example for philosophers in the ethics literature. So yeah, there's a child drowning in the pond. Now, unbeknownst to you, there is an impenetrable force field. Well, maybe it is beknownst to you. I don't know. But there is an impenetrable force field around the pond, such that you actually can't save the child. And I guess the question is, are you responsible for not saving the child? And the thought is, no, it seems like you're not responsible for not saving the child because you couldn't save the child. That seems to be because there's an impenetrable force field there. And so a lot of people have this judgment that we're not responsible for not saving the child. And it seems like the best explanation for that judgment is that one could not have saved the child. Like you couldn't have done otherwise but failed to save the child, as it were. And there's also Philip Swenson has a shark case where I think it's another drowning child. I think there's a drowning child, and like there are sharks in the water, such that even if you had went to go and try to save the child, you wouldn't have. The sharks would have killed you and so on. Maybe you're responsible for not trying to save the child, but it seems really weird to say that you are responsible for not actually saving the child because there were sharks there. They would have eaten you. Like what seems to be driving the judgments here that you're not responsible for failing to save the child is that you couldn't have saved the child, right? So it seems to be the lack of alternative possibilities here that explains non-responsibility. And so the best explanation for our judgments of these cases, so the thought goes, is that responsibility does indeed require alternative possibilities. It does indeed require free will in the leeway sense. So I'm wondering what you think about these cases. If you want to kind of clarify them or if you want to respond to them, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, I think you laid them out nicely. These are compelling cases for a lot of people. And you're right that like Capes and Swenson use these cases to motivate a kind of leeway approach. And interestingly, they both think we should treat these omissions type cases symmetrically with how we treat the traditional Frankfurt case, which involves an action, an overt action, or a choice, but not an omission. So they say, start with, the impenetrable force or the sharks case. And obviously to them, the agent is not responsible for the omission to save the child. They couldn't have helped it, right? And when you couldn't have helped it, it's not your fault. That's the basic idea. And then transfer that judgment to a Frankfurt case. Now it might depend on the details of the case, but if the agent really couldn't have done otherwise than what they did, then they would say the same sort of thing. Yeah, we should think not responsible. I am also in favor of treating the actions and omissions type cases symmetrically, but instead of starting with the no responsibility judgment in the omissions case and transferring it to a Frankfurt case, I start with the responsibility judgment in the Frankfurt case and transfer it over to the omissions case. This is something that is a little bit different about my approach from, say, John Martin Fisher's or Carolina Sartorius, with whom I agree on a lot. They try to have asymmetrical approaches to these kinds of to these two sets of cases, and I think no, it's okay to go the symmetrical response and accept what at first seems counterintuitive, which is that this guy walking along the shore of the shallow pond is I'm going to say he is responsible for omitting to save the child, even though there was an impenetrable force, even though there were sharks. I think it's crucial that the agent does not know about these forces or sharks. If they did, then it's plausible that the reason why they didn't try to save the child, the reason why they omitted to save the child was because they couldn't have done otherwise. And to me, that makes a difference to their responsibility. If they don't know about the sharks, don't know about the impenetrable force field, then the reason for their omission is not because they couldn't have done otherwise. It's because, well, they're selfish. They want to get their clothes wet. Who knows, right? There's some reason that does not excuse them, right? They are to blame for failing to save the child. It would be odd. This is something that Justin Capes and I disagree about, but I think it would be odd if, like, after, this guy fails to jump in and save the child, if you were to find out about the sharks afterwards and then to cite their presence as an excusing factor, like, oh yeah, I wasn't to blame for failing to save the child. There were sharks in the water, when that had no bearing on his reason for not even trying. I think it would be off-putting, I think, to hear someone give that kind of reasoning. So anyway, my response is to take that sort of symmetrical view, but run it in the other direction. Other compatibilists who agree with me that, moral responsibility doesn't require alternative possibilities, they'll want to say something different about these omissions cases. But the trick for them, and this is something that Philip Swenson in particular has done a lot of work to explain, the trick for them is that they've got to explain the relevant difference between the Frankfurt case and these omissions cases, and that turned out to be pretty hard to do.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, these are some practices that we have that wouldn't make sense if there's no free will. So it wouldn't make sense to reward anybody for anything or to punish anyone retributively for anything. It also wouldn't...
He's going to say, yeah, obviously.
Make sense to ever deliberate about what to do. If you're deliberating about what to do, then you're presupposing that you have alternatives and that it's up to you which one is realized. It wouldn't make sense to give people advice. It doesn't make sense to advise somebody to do something that they can't do, but it also doesn't make sense to advise somebody to do something that they can't avoid doing. If determinism is true, everything is something that you either can't do or can't avoid doing, so it doesn't make sense to ever give anybody advice about anything. Also doesn't make sense to evaluate actions. Now, previously, I mentioned that it doesn't make sense to say things are right or wrong, but you can't even evaluate things prudentially or in any other respect because there's only ever one alternative. So it doesn't make sense to talk about like what alternative should be done from any perspective if there's only one alternative. And just doing things for any reason doesn't make any sense because, again, you can't have reasons for doing something if you don't have any alternatives available.
All right, so much there.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's a lot of
so
the same sort of stuff.
we're just going to pause on each one of these. Okay, so the practices that apparently don't make sense if we don't have alternative courses of action available to us. Reward and punishment. That's the first one. I'll turn it over to you. What do you think about that? Does that not make sense if there are no alternative course of action?
I think this largely depends on what we say about the previous point about whether reactive attitudes are ever apt. Because if someone really does deserve resentment or gratitude, then I think practices like punishment or reward are going to make perfect sense. Now there are lots of complicating factors. It could be that someone's to blame and yet it's inappropriate for us to punish them. Maybe someone is praiseworthy, but like I don't know, you don't have the standing to show to the reactive attitude or something like that, or to reward or punish. Lots of complicating factors. But again, this is largely going to like the reason for thinking that these wouldn't make sense is because we're already convinced that we couldn't be morally responsible. We couldn't really deserve praise or blame if we lack alternative possibilities. And so we've already seen some reason to be skeptical of that. Why don't you talk through the other ones? I think you've thought a little bit more about some of these other practices.
Well, but hold on. So, but isn't his view that it's completely insane, just like common sense kind of claim? Like, look, this isn't the way we act. Now, the Strawson points, I agree that we that's an important point. But it seems like Huemer's point here is just like, this doesn't make sense of what we ordinarily do or say, how we think of ourselves in the world, which may be true. Um,
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on the reward punishment, the one thing that I did want to highlight is that, yeah, he is here, again, assuming that responsibility requires leeway. Now, again, he
Yeah.
tried to give reasons for that earlier, but, we have sort of discussed those. So it doesn't seem to be an additional independent argument in that sense here. Also, I do think we should at least keep in mind that there are lots of potential justifications for punishment that don't appeal to someone deserving punishment because of
Yes,
something
right.
for which they're responsible, right? There are forward-looking consequentialist reasons for punishing, like incapacitating the criminal, which increases our collective safety. Things like deterrence, right, can further deter crime. Things like rehabilitation of the person so we can get them to be a productive, loving citizen again. So I think there are lots of forward-looking consequentialist reasons, or at least potential justifications for punishment that don't
Yeah.
require even responsibility. So even if responsibility does require leeway, it could still be justified to punish people and reward people and so on.
Right.
So I think that's another potential challenge to what he said. But yeah, so for some of the other ones, deliberation he said doesn't make sense. I mean, I think we talked about this earlier where no, does deliberation, do we really need to assume that alternative possibilities are like metaphysically open to us? Like there's genuine indeterminacy out there in the world? Or do we only need it to be the case in order for deliberation to be appropriate and make sense, that things are like just epistemically open to us? Like it might, for all we know, happen that this alternative course of action obtains, or it might, for all we know, be that this alternative course of action obtains. And by means of going through this deliberative process and weighing my reasons and so on, I kind of find out, as it were, which of those are indeed going to be the ones that I'm going to be taking. And at the very least, it's just not clear to me that we need metaphysical possibilities that are metaphysically open to us, as opposed to these epistemic possibilities, these things that might, for all.
right, but I don't think that really gets at the main source of the intuition, because the intuition is that the process itself is determined. So the going through weighing of all the options, like how you weight the options, how much weight you assign to each of the options, how you take the overall distribution of the weights, what you take that to imply, the whole deliberative process. So that's why there's only one outcome, because it's the process itself of going through each one and coming to each conclusion, which is determined. That's the source of the intuition. That's like, well, there's no real options here, because you're not really deliberating in the sense of trying to pick which of these options is the best. You're simulating it or something like that. It's like there's you're knocking the dominoes down and they go, but there's no sense in which they. Well, anyway, so I'm just not saying that I think that this is conclusive, but this is what the intuition is. This is what Huemer's trying to get at when he says you're not really deliberating or acting for reasons or anything like that if hard determinism is true, which is an argument against compatibilism. So what they're trying to come back with is to say, no, you are doing these things, but just not in some spooky way or something like that. But I think this is the real heart of the debate.
No obtain, even if they aren't genuine, like metaphysical possibilities that are open to us.
Right.
That's deliberation. About advice, I'll turn over to you after I talk about this advice thing, because I want to hear your take on it.
Mm-hmm.
But that one seemed thoroughly wrong-headed to me. Giving advice can be the very thing that determines, or at least significantly influences, the person to do the thing in question. If that thing is in their best interest, or if it's a good outcome in some other way, like it promotes human flourishing, well, then it makes perfect sense to try to influence or even determine people in this sort of way, even if they can't do otherwise than what they eventually end up doing. In short, advising someone can be the very means by which they're determined to act in accordance with the content of that advice. Of course, perhaps together with their other beliefs and desires and values and reasons and so on. So yeah, that's my take on the advice thing. I wonder what you think about the advice one.
Yeah, I agree with that point, and I think this is related to some of the points that we were talking about earlier. If determinism's true, and even if determinism rules out free will, it doesn't follow that like we have no influence on the way that things inevitably unfold, right? It could be that the way that you deliberate is what shapes the physically necessary future, and the same could be true of advice. So I think on all these points, like having free will wouldn't render these things incoherent, or sorry, lacking free will wouldn't render these things incoherent. Like, yeah, you could still make sense of deliberation, advice, and many of the rest of these practices, even punishment. And in fact, most free will skeptics like Dirk Perregoob, Greg Caruso, who have written a ton on exactly these topics, they agree. Yeah, we can still deliberate. There can still be,
Yeah, I'm going to get Greg on the Consciousness Live at some point. He was supposed to come on way back when, but it didn't work out. Now we're trying to get him back. But I want to talk to him about this stuff.
behavior. There can still, yeah, advice can still make sense. Even maybe we need to think about the justification for it entirely differently, but punishment can even make sense. So it's interesting that Huemer is taking such a hard line on all of these practices.
Yeah, and the final two practices here, one of them was practical evaluation, and this one, I said in my notes, this one seems very implausible to me. So as Huemer says, if there's only one like metaphysical alternative, if there's only one alternative course of action available to us, all practical evaluation is impossible. So just evaluating our actions in any way whatsoever is impossible. That just seems very implausible to me, because to me it seems like we can use epistemic possibilities and epistemic probabilities here, which is already standard practice in decision theory, right? Yeah. So for the audience, an epistemic probability is basically just a measure of the degree to which our evidence supports a proposition, and an epistemic possibility is something that might, for all we know, be the case or come to be the case, okay? Now, among the range of live epistemic possibilities for how the world is or will come to be, we can assign utilities to those various outcomes, like how good they are or how bad they are, and so on. And we can then reason about the expected utilities of various courses of action by using the epistemic probabilities that we attach to those various epistemically possible outcomes. Like, how probable do I think on my evidence is this outcome to obtain? How probable do I think on my evidence is this outcome to obtain? And then you multiply those probabilities by the utilities of those outcomes to get the expected utilities. And that seems like a perfectly adequate way to go about practical reasoning. This is how they do it in decision theory. So it doesn't even require all genuine metaphysical openness or alternative possibilities. All you need is these epistemic notions. So this point about practical evaluation seems so implausible to me. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think the same sort of thing. And
okay.
Yeah, again, like judgments about a person's character, judgments about the quality of an action, like all those things still make sense even if we think no one's ever really free, right? Like suppose I become convinced, I don't see this happening, but suppose I become convinced that we don't have free will, that no one's ever had free will. I can still say like, that's a better person than that person, right?
Yeah.
Or he's a worse X than she is, or something like that. Like that all seems to make sense. Even if
but that doesn't address so you can say in the same sense that you can say that hurricane is a worse hurricane than the other one. It's causing more damage or destruction or something. That's right. But that's not the sense in which these terms are being used, or this deliberation is about how to evaluate those actions. That you can't make sense of, I would say, right? So I'm not sure if they're really addressing.
It wasn't up to them that they were like that or anything like that.
Some elements of supportability are indeed up to people plausibly, but take a sport where like it's not up to the people how good they are in that. Like we can still say you're like a better sport player, like you're better at that sport than this other person.
Right.
And so similarly, it seems like we can still say if we have certain views about what's good and bad and what's valuable and disvaluable, we can still say like this person is a better person than that person, even if there's as you say, there's no free will at all whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So, and like we can also evaluate actions in that sort of way, even if the people aren't responsible for them. So, and that's a kind of practical evaluation right. of an action. So, yeah, I mean this one is a little bit baffling to me, but and then
it is key that he's interested in practical evaluation. So
yes,
yeah, he might not think that there's any problem with saying that's a better character than that, but I do think that the people's characters do shape their actions, and we do evaluate actions on the basis of good characters better than those on the basis of bad characters, and we wouldn't have to give that up just because we denied free will.
Yeah, exactly. And his final one was doing things for any reason, and we sort of already addressed that one. And yeah, I mean that one just seems really implausible to me. Like sometimes we have overwhelming practical reason to do something, and that overwhelming reason itself determines us to do it. Just like our being aware of the reason renders it inevitable that we're going to do it. That doesn't mean that we like don't even have the reason because we couldn't have done otherwise or anything like that. No, it's precisely because we had the reason that we can't do otherwise. So it's like Anyway, I don't quite get the one where it's like doing things for any reason. Like there can still be considerations that favor performing.
Sorry, I think that's a different sense of could have done otherwise.
And it self-determines us to do it. Just like our being aware of the reason renders it inevitable that we're going to do it. That doesn't mean that we like don't even have the reason because we couldn't have done otherwise or anything like that. No, it's precisely because we had the reason that we can't do otherwise. So it's like, anyway, I don't quite get the one where it's like doing things for any reason. Like there can still be considerations that favor performing certain actions. Maybe because the good consequences that result from them, maybe for various other reasons. But yeah, that one seemed plausible to me. But yeah, okay. So next up is determinism self-defeating?
Okay, so now I'm going to explain why I claim that determinism is self-defeating. I'm not the first person to come up with this idea. So this was said by Epicurus, an ancient Greek philosopher. He said, "The man who says that all things come to pass by necessity cannot criticize one who denies that all things come to pass by necessity, for he admits that this too happens of necessity." So the idea being that the determinist can't criticize a free will believer because on the determinist view, the free will believer just can't help believing in free will. Yeah. And then this is from the 20th century British philosopher J.R. Lucas. He says, "Determinism cannot be true because if it was, we should not take the determinist arguments as being really arguments, but as being only conditioned reflexes. Their statements should not be regarded as really claiming to be true, but only as seeking to cause us to respond in some way desired by them." All right, so these are previous people who thought that determinism was self-defeating. And by the way, this is not my argument. My argument is to follow, but I'm also claiming that determinism is self-defeating in the ways to be explained on the following slides.
Okay, so Huemer is not offering these as arguments, and he's not saying he endorses them. Okay, so for the audience, Huemer is not claiming to endorse these. He's just pointing out that these are precedents for his argument/view that determinism is self-defeating. I did just want to see if you had anything to say about these.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, I mean, historians of philosophy might debate this, but I think it's more likely that Epicurus was not thinking of determinism in the sense that we've been using it. He was probably thinking of something like logical fatalism or something along those lines, maybe theological determinism, but maybe not. In any case, he thought that there was a kind of indeterminacy in the world, and that thinking that everything happens of necessity, maybe of logical necessity.
That's the swerve in the atoms, that famous whoosh, get their swerve on.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe of theological necessity, probably not causal necessity. But in any case, then, yeah, there's something self-defeating about that. Again, Huemer's not endorsing Epicurus's argument, but Epicurus might be giving a very different kind of argument, I think.
The next one where it's like, not even offering an argument, it's like a conditioned reflex. What? I mean, determinism doesn't imply that determinists don't need to be committed to the view that our actions aren't really actions. They're not.
Yeah, that's almost as bad as the argument against the eliminativists that say, oh, they don't believe in beliefs, and yet they're believing their view. It's like, come on, not great.
Reasons responsive or so on. They're just conditioned reflexes. We're just these automata. These robots were unconscious, and what? Of course there could still be arguments, and of course, you can still be responsive to reasons, and it's just so implausible.
Yeah, and if people are interested in the details there, I mean, it does strike a lot of people as right that there's something weird about trying to convince someone of something, giving someone an argument for something if you think everything is determined. I don't find that weird, but a lot of people do find that weird. I would advise people to read A Free Will Skeptic who disagrees with that kind of argument. Dirk Peribim has written a lot on argument and deliberation, that sort of thing, even believing that we don't have free will.
Yeah, I mean, well, the point that you just made there, it seems to be the same point with advice. Advising someone is the very means by which they can be determined to act in accordance with the content of the advice, and giving someone an argument can be the very means by which they are determined to come to believe in the relevant conclusion of the argument. Because let's say they are appropriately responsive to the relevant reasons that you're giving, and the reasons that you're giving are so strong that they just render it inevitable that the person comes to believe the conclusion.
Exactly. It's like the pool ball example. So if someone hits the pool ball, but you want to go somewhere else, the whole system is determined, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to intervene in the system. So if you stick the ball with a different cue, then it'll go in a different direction. So I guess that's kind of Joe's point, is that if you want to intervene in the system by giving it advice, that's how it's going to be determining it. Of course, I think the main point is that by giving advice, you're sort of assuming that they have a different option, not that there's no possible way to make sense of this. That's how I was reading or hearing what Huemer was saying, was that our ordinary common sense way of thinking and talking is at odds with determinism. But not the stronger claim. There's no possible way to make sense of these things. Although that is what he says, because he calls it insane and self-defeating. But I think it's aimed more at common sense. But who knows? I could be being overly charitable.
Wrong about that. Anyway, I just okay. So again, Huemer's not endorsing these arguments here. Okay, that's for the audience. I just wanted to cover these because I sometimes see this in the popular sphere, and it gets my eyes rolling every time.
Yeah.
So first, the problem with deliberation. So deciding what to believe about free will and determinism itself is a form of deliberation. But as I previously said on a previous slide, deliberation presupposes free will. It doesn't make sense to deliberate about what to do if there aren't alternatives, or if which alternative is realized isn't up to you, right? And so that means that just in the process of deciding what to believe about this very issue, you could not coherently decide to accept determinism. Right? You couldn't do that coherently in the sense that you would have to presuppose that determinism is false in coming to decide to believe it determinism.
All right, so what do you think about that?
I guess I don't really have anything new to add here. I think for the reasons we've already talked through, deliberation doesn't presuppose leeway. At least I think there's good reason to be skeptical of that second premise here. And so I'm not moved by this argument.
Yeah, like at the very, like when we say leeway, you mean like metaphysical leeway, like
Yeah,
genuinely
right.
metaphysically possible alternative course
Right.
of action open to you. Now you're definitely open to there not even being required epistemic leeway. Like you're open to that. But
Right.
you know, one might think that,
I
well,
mean, hold on, because there's a sense in which, Huemer is not wildly off base. Suppose that, there was, my son's class had a debate about which cookie to have and then had to vote over it, Oreos or chocolate chips, as a way to get them to talk about voting. Suppose that it was already determined what the winner was in advance, not according to their vote at all. By the way, I think chocolate chip won when Oreo should have won, clearly. But anyway, suppose that it was determined already that chocolate chip was going to win, and then the kids are in there debating about what their favorite cookie is and which one they like the best, and they think that voting is going to have this effect of determining the outcome, but really it's already set in advance, and they're trying to decide which one should I vote for. Well, gee, I like this one, I like that one. So it does seem a bit futile and pointless that they're in there deliberating if the outcome's already decided. So that's kind of, I think, the point that Huemer is trying to make, is that on determinism, when you're deliberating, you're trying to pick between options. But if the outcome's already determined, then the very sense of trying to pick the very thing you're trying to do to pick between options doesn't make any sense, because when you try to pick between options, we expect that you actually have some ability to choose between those in a way that isn't preset. So that could be wrong, of course, but I don't think that's like nonsensical or weird to think. I think that's pretty much ordinary. Now, if that's what you think, then yeah, deliberating when you're trying to think, should I believe in determinism? Well, if you're really a determinist, it wouldn't really make sense to really deliberate. Now, I would say the real problem with Huemer's argument is that he's assuming a kind of libertarian free will here, that deliberation is you freely choosing between the options. But I think he really is thinking that's the only way to make sense of deliberation, because this compatibilist version of it isn't really deliberation. They haven't really talked about that in this debate. I wish people would bring this up in the debates. But it seems like it's missing.
maybe you do need kind of epistemic leeway. That is
Right.
alternative epistemically possible courses of action, like quote unquote epistemically open to you, etc. So
Right.
just want to make that crucial distinction between epistemic leeway and metaphysical leeway.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, another thing for the audience at least, I just want to note, not that Huemer disagrees with this, but I just want to note that this argument would at best show that one cannot consistently deliberate while also believing determinism, right? Determinism may still be true, and it may still be compatible with moral responsibility. So the argument has limited dialectical scope. Now again, I think Huemer would grant this, but it's an important point for the audience. As an analogy, right, just like suppose that our aesthetic faculties were wired in such a way that we couldn't consistently use our aesthetic sense and engage the world aesthetically while simultaneously believing that aesthetic value and beauty and so on are subjective, that is, dependent on our preferences or subjective reactions. Even if that were the case, right, it wouldn't show that aesthetic value and beauty aren't subjective, right? It could still be the case that they're subjective. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, so now onto the argument problem.
Okay, here's the problem about argumentation. Arguments are attempts to supply reasons for believing something. But as I previously claimed, if determinism is true, then there are no reasons for anything whatsoever. There can't be a reason to do A if you can't do A, and there also can't be reason to do A if you can't avoid doing A. So any argument for determinism is self-defeating. So I think of there's an interesting Star Trek episode in which there's this alien species called the Q, and one of the Q is on board the Enterprise. And at the time, the Enterprise is trying to deal with this problem where a moon is about to crash into an inhabited planet. And so they ask Q for advice. And Q says, well, just change the gravitational constant of the universe. Okay, and then Commander Data has to explain that they can't do that. And now imagine that Q said, well, I know you can't do it, but you should still do it anyway. Okay, that does not make sense, right? It's not true that they should change the gravitational constant in any way because they can't do it. And it's also not true that they have good reason or the most reason to change the gravitational constant. That's not what they have reason to do, right? They have reason to do the things that they can do.
What do you think about the argument problem?
So I guess one thing that strikes me as interesting is that Huemer seems to be talking about giving reasons for believing things at first, like arguments. But then when he talks through the premise two, I think it is, and the conclusion, he's focusing specifically on reasons for doing things, like
Yeah.
practical reasons. And that might be different from, yeah, what we normally think of as argumentation. So that's something that struck me as potentially problematic with the argument. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote down like seems to be kind of confusing epistemic and practical reasons. I mean, so for the audience, an epistemic reason for P, so for like believing P, or we could even say an epistemic reason for like the content of the belief that P, is basically something like a consideration that provides justification or support or evidence for the content of the belief. And whether some consideration is evidence for the content of the belief doesn't seem to depend on whether we have like alternative courses of action or belief available to us. So, for instance, like the fact that plants receive water flourish while water deprived plants in otherwise identical conditions languish, that fact would still provide evidence that plants need water to flourish, even if determinism were true and we could never act or believe differently than we in fact do. I mean, it's just irrelevant to the evidential support relation between those propositions. There could still be evidential support relations between propositions, and so argumentation and basing our beliefs on arguments, like even if determinism is true, so it seems to me. And I guess just more generally, epistemic reasons don't seem to require leeway, either in action or in belief. Like even if some flat earther is blinded by bias and consequently rendered unable to change their belief in a flat earth, even when presented with photos and various other facts, seems like they still have reason to think that the earth is round, or at least.
Yeah, I know. So the difference between subjective reason, objective reason, I don't know. So the reason talk is confusing, but so here the argument problem is when we're thinking of giving arguments, we're trying to convince somebody of something, but you can't. That doesn't really make sense under determinism. Is how I would view what Huemer is saying, which I get that intuition pretty strongly. So I don't know. I wonder going to get Sapolsky's response. After this, I might go and watch the actual exchange between the two if there is one.
At the very least, that there are reasons. And also, it seems like we can still epistemically criticize this flat earther, like by saying that they should still be proportioning their beliefs to the evidence. They shouldn't believe falsehoods like that the earth is flat, that they're being irrational, and so on. And all of this, at least to me, seems true, even if the flat earther, given their ingrained biases, can't do otherwise than believe that the earth is flat. So at the very least, this kind of epistemic normativity, so being able to like epistemically criticize someone, saying that they're rational or irrational, saying that they have a reason or don't have a reason for their beliefs, it just doesn't seem to require alternative doxastic possibilities. So yeah, alternative to you.
Yeah, I think I just agree with what you said in response. So yeah, I guess I think there's some kind of slide or equivocation that's happening between theoretical and practical reasons to do things or believe things in the argument. And then also, even if we made this all about one of those, I'm going to deny that second premise. I think there could be reasons for believing something and also reasons for doing things, even if determinism is true, for the reasons we talked through earlier.
Yeah, yeah. And so let's now talk about like that gravitational constant case.
Yeah.
So I mean, one thing that I think here is like maybe at best that sort of reasoning would show that okay, in some instances in which we can't do something, it is thereby not the case that we should do it, and also thereby not the case that we have a reason to do it. But that of course wouldn't show that like in every instance in which we
Right.
can't do something, these consequences hold.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I just think it's a bit of a hasty generalization there.
Yeah. And what's interesting is we have reason to think it won't generalize from that case to all cases. And the reason is in that case, the Riker, I think it is, and the others, they know that they can't do otherwise. And that's why they're refraining from changing the gravitational constant. They know that's not a possibility. If they didn't know that, they thought they could take certain steps to change the gravitational constant, and they were just like, we'll just let the moon crash or whatever it is. Then I think we would think differently about the case, right? So anyway, I think yeah, this going back to the discussion of Frankfurt cases earlier, I think alternative possibilities are not required for moral responsibility. But if a person does something because they couldn't have done otherwise, especially if they know they couldn't have done otherwise, right, that might make a difference to how we think of their responsibility. And that's exactly what this kind of case is highlighting.
Yeah, and there are even other reasons for thinking that it wouldn't generalize are precisely the cases in which we judge that, or at least some of us are inclined to intuitively judge that someone doesn't have alternative possibilities and yet they still should have done what they did or should have done otherwise, we can say. And we gave some of those cases earlier, right? With the Tom Kelly's case of hacking off the arm, the Nomi Arpali case, the case of like the mother who couldn't but care for the infant and so on.
Okay, now the rationality problem. Rational thinking, I claim, presupposes certain norms. So if you're trying to figure out what to believe and you're trying to figure out what's true, you're presupposing that truth should be preferred to error. And you're presupposing, if you're giving arguments and receiving arguments, you're presupposing things like that we should base our beliefs on the evidence, right? And there's a series of other norms about rational discourse, like you shouldn't contradict yourself and so on. But if determinism is true, then nobody ever should do anything, because everything is either impossible or unavoidable. And it doesn't really make sense to think that you should do something if you can't do it or if you can't avoid doing it. So thus, you can't rationally believe in determinism.
Okay, I know what you're going to say, but I'll turn it over to you nonetheless.
I think I can't add any more here than what we've already said. I mean, we specifically thought about that claim that someone saying that someone should do something requires that they have leeway, freedom, and it's not clear that there's good reason for thinking that's true.
Right, and also, like, even if that's true in the case of action, like, if I were a libertarian about free will, I still think I would say that's only true of action. That's not true in the case of belief. Like, sure, like it only makes sense to say that you should do something, you should perform some action if you it only makes sense to say that if you could have done otherwise or whatever. Again, assuming that I'm like a libertarian, but like in terms of belief, whether or not you should believe something, or whether or not you should proportion your credences to the evidential probabilities, or whether or not you should do these various epistemically normative things, even as a libertarian, I'd be inclined to say, no, those kinds of the epistemic normativity does not require alternative doxastic possibilities, because of course we don't have alternative doxastic possibilities. Like, I can't like choose to believe that I don't have hands, or I can't like choose to. It's like I don't really control my epistemic responses. At least I don't have a kind of direct control of them. And nevertheless, it seems like norms apply to belief, and these various normative truths about what I should believe, even though I don't have kind of control over my beliefs. So it just seems very implausible. Like, even if I granted that you need these alternative courses of action available to you, if it's going to be the case that you should do something or shouldn't do something, it's just not going to transfer over to belief. And in order for Huemer to run his rationality problem, he does indeed need to run this in terms of epistemic normativity, right? So yeah, that's one of my biggest hangups for that.
Yeah.
But it's rational normativity. And so even if you thought that stuff about belief was okay, which I'm generally inclined to agree with, you don't really, not a voluntarist about the belief. I don't think you get to choose what you believe. You can try to get yourself to come to believe things and so forth, but if you either believe it or you don't, on the basis of evidence, the evidence hopefully controls what you believe or has an influence on it at least. But when you're reasoning about what you should believe, one likes to think that it's not inevitable what the conclusion one's going to come to. And then if it were, then it would be very strange. So I guess I feel the intuition's on his side more than they do. But
yeah, maybe one last thought from me is, even if Huemer is right that, like, I don't know, it would be silly or self-defeating for us to believe in determinism, it's not totally clear that it follows that we have free will, which is what he's ultimately trying to argue against Sapolsky. And now maybe, again, this is like a debate that's assuming certain shared assumptions, certain shared beliefs about incompatibilism, say, or something like that. And so maybe he's taking that kind of stuff for granted. But again, they don't sort of make those caveats, which might be misleading if you're not aware that there's plenty of room for thinking that determinism is not really a threat to free will.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know you already recognize this, but like, to be totally fair to them, like, they only have 10 minutes and they kind of recognize that each other, they both are kind of like incompatibilists, right? So they're kind of, so like, we both want to be fully fair to the participants in the debate and so on. But that's why we have this conversation where we can emphasize these things to the audience that they are eliding. And maybe they're justified in eliding them, right? But we just want to make people aware of these sorts of things, because we should not be like just assuming that.
Very cool. Okay, so go and subscribe to Majesty of Reason, and he's asking people to support him on the PayPal. So if you can do that, I recommend it. He's doing good work making people aware of this stuff. All right, so maybe I'll go check out the Sapolsky and see what he's going to say back, because I would like to hear his response.